There are moments in the lives of great artists when time itself becomes a mirror, reflecting not just the years they have lived, but the toll those years have taken. For Sir Rod Stewart, that mirror stands before him now, at 80. Once the unstoppable voice of rebellion and romance, the man whose rasping tone could ignite an arena or soothe a broken heart, finds himself facing the hardest chapter of all, the quiet, unglamorous struggle of growing old in the public eye. For more than 6 decades, Rod Stewart's name has meant energy, swagger, and charm. He was the face of British rock's playful defiance, the lad from North London who made good, who sang about love and heartbreak, and who lived both with reckless abandon. But the story that has unfolded in recent years is not one of glittering stages or screaming fans. It is one of surgeries, fatigue, cancelled tours, private grief, and the painful reckoning with one's own mortality. XC Stewart has survived cancer, multiple throat surgeries, and the kind of relentless touring schedule that could break even the strongest of men. But the real tragedy of Rod Stewart isn't just in his battles with illness or the fading of youth. It's in the cruel irony that the man who once seemed immortal now grapples with fragility, even as the world still demands he perform like he's 25. Turning 80 hasn't slowed him in spirit, but it has changed him in ways that no melody can hide. In recent interviews, his tone has softened, the sparkle is still there, but it's laced with a deeper, sadder truth. He talks more often about family, his 8 children, his wife Penny, his regrets as a father, and the fear of leaving too soon. He speaks of mortality with an honesty that can only come from someone who has faced it more than once. The tragedy of Rod Stewart is not that he is aging, it is that the world isn't ready to see him as anything but eternal. The boy who sang his heart out on the streets of London, the rock star who filled stadiums, and the elder statesman of music who still steps onto the stage with that mischievous grin, all exist within the same fragile man. And now, as he faces the final chapters of his extraordinary life, we begin to understand the cost of greatness. There are few lives in modern music that read like a novel, one filled with rebellion, heartbreak, laughter, and pain. Rod Stewart's life, however, doesn't just read like a novel, it feels like a rock and roll epic written in sweat, sound, and survival. The story begins far from the global fame, far from the grand stages of Wembley or Madison Square Garden. It begins in a modest household in Highgate, North London, where a young boy's voice first rose above the hum of working-class life. Born Roderick David Stewart on January 10, 1945, he entered a world recovering from war but full of dreams. His father, Robert Stewart, was a Scottish builder and football enthusiast. His mother, Elsie, a warm English homemaker who encouraged creativity and hard work. The Stewarts were a large, tight-knit family, the kind where every penny mattered and every victory was shared. For Rod, the youngest of 5 children, the world seemed both huge and within reach. Music didn't come immediately. In his early years, his passion was football, not fame. Stewart once dreamed of being a professional footballer and even had a trial with Brentford Football Club. The discipline and drive he learned from the sport would later shape his career in surprising ways. But fate had other plans. As the British music scene began to explode in the late 1950s, young Rod found himself drawn to the sounds of Elvis Presley, Little Richard, and Sam Cooke, voices that carried both rebellion and emotion. Those sounds would soon become his language. By his late teens, Stewart was busking on the streets, playing harmonica and singing in train stations. His was not an overnight success story. He struggled, performing in small pubs, joining short-lived bands, sleeping in rail stations when he couldn't afford a bed. But even then, there was something unmistakable about him. That raspy, soulful voice, that unruly hair, that glint in his eye, they set him apart in a sea of dreamers. His first major break came when he joined the Jeff Beck Group in the late 1960s. It was here that the world began to take notice. With Jeff Beck's fierce guitar and Rod's fiery vocals, they became one of the defining sounds of the British blues rock movement. Songs like I Ain't Superstitious and Morning Dew showcased not just a talented singer, but a man who could feel every lyric he sang. Critics called him the voice of pain and passion, a tag that would follow him throughout his career. But fame, even in its early form, was never kind to the sensitive. Stewart was a man of contradictions, brash yet shy, confident yet deeply insecure. Behind the wild stage persona was a young man who feared failure and craved acceptance. The pressures of the road, the endless recording sessions, and the chaos of fame began to take their toll. Yet somehow, he kept going. When he joined Faces in 1969, his public identity exploded. Alongside Ronnie Wood and other rock comrades, Stewart helped define a new kind of rock star, one who could laugh, drink, and still bring down the house. The camaraderie was real, the parties legendary, and the music unforgettable. Stay With Me became an anthem, a song that captured everything about the swagger and energy of that era. For Rod, it was freedom. But it was also a disguise, a way to hide the loneliness that fame so often brings. Then came Every Picture Tells a Story in 1971. The album that made Rod Stewart a global superstar. Maggie May, a song that nearly didn't make the record, became an unexpected worldwide hit. It wasn't just a song, it was an anthem of youth, regret, and longing. It told a story millions could relate to, the bittersweet ache of love and loss. For Rod, it was his life in melody. Success brought him everything he once dreamed of: fame, money, women, and recognition. Yet, even in the midst of all that, the shadow of tragedy began to form. Stewart would later admit that fame gave him everything but peace. The parties, the travel, the luxury, they came at a cost. The voice that made him famous was also fragile, and he began to fear losing it. Relationships faltered, marriages collapsed, and the relentless pursuit of more began to feel hollow. By the time he turned 40, he had already lived several lifetimes, as a singer, a lover, a father, and a survivor. But the turning point at 80 would reveal a much deeper truth: that every rise hides a fall, and every song of triumph carries a note of pain. Now, looking back on those early years, the contrast is heartbreaking. The young man with fire in his veins, who sang his heart out for strangers and lived like there was no tomorrow, is now confronting the one thing he never sang about: time. And as the lights dim on the stage that defined his life, Rod Stewart stands as a testament to both glory and fragility. A man who gave everything to his music and in doing so, lost parts of himself along the way. By the early 1970s, Rod Stewart had become more than just a name in rock music. He was a movement. The boy who once buskied for spare coins was suddenly a global phenomenon. What made Rod different wasn't just his voice, but his sincerity. In an era defined by excess and ego, Rod had the uncanny ability to connect emotionally with his audience. When he sang, he wasn't just performing, he was confessing. His voice carried grit and warmth in equal measure, and behind that scruffy blonde hair and cheeky grin was a storyteller who understood the pulse of ordinary people. London had shaped him, but it could no longer contain him. The smoky pubs and backstreet clubs gave way to packed arenas, and the once hungry kid from Highgate was now being courted by record labels, managers, and producers who saw in him not just a musician, but a brand. Yet fame, as always, is a double-edged sword. While the world was falling in love with Rod Stewart, the man himself was struggling to keep his balance. By the dawn of the 1980s, Rod Stewart had conquered nearly every corner of the music world. He had the fame, the fortune, the women, and the admiration of millions. Yet behind the glitter of stardom, something deeper was stirring, an emptiness that no applause could fill. To the public, Rod was the charming rogue, the eternal flirt, the man who could make you laugh one moment and break your heart the next. But privately, he was beginning to feel the weight of everything fame had taken from him. When a person becomes a legend, the world forgets that they are human. Every smile, every gesture, every song becomes part of a performance, a mask. For Rod, the mask of the rock star was both his armor and his prison. He had built an image that millions adored: the rebellious lad with a soft heart, the romantic who lived fast and loved freely. But that image came with expectations, and living up to it began to drain him. Fame had its rewards, but it also isolated him. Wherever he went, eyes followed. Every word he spoke could become tomorrow's headline. Relationships became complicated, not because Rod didn't care, but because trust became almost impossible. When you're famous, he once reflected, you never really know who's with you for you and who's there for the story. His love life became legendary, and often misunderstood. Over the decades, Rod Stewart was linked with some of the most beautiful women in the world. Britt Ekland, the Swedish actress known for her roles in The Wicker Man and The Man with the Golden Gun, was one of his most famous partners. Their relationship, full of glamour and chaos, became tabloid fodder across Europe. They were the golden couple, beautiful, wild, and reckless. But the love that looked perfect from the outside was often stormy behind closed doors. The demands of touring, jealousy, and Rod's own restlessness took their toll. He later admitted that during those years, he was a hopeless romantic with a wandering heart. His relationships, no matter how passionate, rarely lasted. The lifestyle of a global rock star was simply too consuming. Yet, despite the heartbreak, Stewart never stopped believing in love. His vulnerability, which came through so clearly in his music, was a reflection of a man who kept hoping that the next romance would be the one that finally brought him peace. His marriage to Alana Hamilton, the ex-wife of actor George Hamilton, seemed to mark a new chapter. They married in 1979, and Rod appeared genuinely in love. Together, they had 2 children, Kimberly and Sean, and for a time, it seemed like he had finally found stability. But the marriage was strained by fame, infidelity, and distance. Stewart was touring constantly, and the temptations of the road proved difficult to resist. When the marriage ended in 1984, Rod described it as one of the darkest periods of his life. In the midst of all this, his professional life also began to shift. The 1980s were a new era in music, one dominated by changing tastes, synthesizers, and the emerging MTV culture. Stewart adapted, as he always had, but the pressure to stay relevant weighed heavily. Songs like Young Turks and Infatuation kept him in the charts, but the critics began to question whether he had lost touch with his roots. "I was trying to please everyone," he said years later. "But in doing that, I almost lost myself." Amid the chaos, the toll on his voice, his greatest gift, began to show. Years of singing night after night, often with little rest and too much alcohol, left scars that wouldn't heal easily. His raspy tone, once natural and effortless, began to strain. Doctors warned him to slow down, but slowing down wasn't in Rod's nature. Performing was his lifeline, his identity. Then came the loneliness, the kind that only those at the top can understand. Fame, as dazzling as it seems, often creates a hollow echo. After the lights dim and the audience disappears, silence fills the room. For Rod, those quiet moments were the hardest. He had everything he thought he wanted: success, recognition, luxury. Yet he often felt more alone than he ever had in the days when he was struggling to survive. He once told a friend, "When you've sung to 100,000 people, going home to an empty house is deafening." That quote, simple yet devastating, revealed the heart of Rod Stewart's tragedy. The applause, no matter how loud, couldn't drown out the ache of solitude. And yet, through it all, he never lost his humor or humility. That mischievous grin, the same one that had charmed audiences since the 1960s, never faded. He still laughed easily, loved deeply, and spoke openly about his flaws. He didn't hide from his mistakes, he owned them. In interviews, he was refreshingly honest about his failures as a husband, his struggles with fame, and his endless pursuit of happiness. "I've made a mess of things more than once," he said, "but I've always tried to put it right. That's all you can do." The 1980s were a decade of contradictions for Rod Stewart: commercial triumph and personal turmoil, reinvention and exhaustion, fame and isolation. Yet, beneath it all, there remained an unshakable resilience. The same fire that drove the young boy from Highgate to chase his dreams was still burning, even if dimmer. He had lost love, questioned his identity, and flirted with self-destruction, but he had also survived, and survival in the world of rock and roll is its own kind of victory. The burden of fame had left its marks, but it had also forged a man of depth and wisdom. The heartbreaks that once tore him apart would later fuel his most poignant songs, and the loneliness he endured would teach him the true value of connection. For Rod Stewart, the journey was far from over. The decades ahead would bring both tragedy and redemption, illness and renewal, but also the kind of peace that can only come from facing one's own reflection and still finding a reason to smile. By the mid-1980s, Rod Stewart stood at a crossroads, not just in his career, but in his soul. The man who once embodied the rebellious joy of British rock now found himself battling the one enemy no artist can escape: time. Fame, once exhilarating, had become an unrelenting test of endurance. The stage lights still burned brightly, the fans still screamed, but behind those moments of glory was a man fighting to hold himself together. The music industry was changing rapidly. The raw guitar-driven sound that had defined Rod's early years was giving way to a polished, synthesized world. MTV had redefined what it meant to be a star. Image was now as important as sound. For younger acts, that was an opportunity. For veterans like Rod, it was a challenge. "I had to reinvent myself again and again," he later said. "Otherwise, I'd be swept aside like yesterday's news." He didn't go quietly. Rod adapted, crafting hits that embraced the times without losing his identity. Songs like Some Guys Have All the Luck 1984 and Forever Young 1988 proved that he could evolve. Yet, even as his music stayed popular, he began to sense that something essential was slipping away, that emotional authenticity that had once made his voice feel like an extension of the listener's heart. The pressures of maintaining success were relentless. Touring became a grind rather than a joy. The constant travel, the late nights, and the endless interviews drained him. He began to feel the physical consequences of decades spent on the road: exhaustion, back pain, and vocal fatigue. Doctors warned him to slow down, but slowing down felt like giving up. "If I stop singing," he told a friend, "I'll stop breathing." But there were deeper struggles that no one could see. His second marriage to model Rachel Hunter began in 1990 with passion and optimism. Rod was smitten, describing her as the one. But the 24-year age gap soon became an issue. While Rod was seeking stability, Rachel was still exploring her independence. When the marriage collapsed in 1999, it left him devastated. "It broke me in two," he later admitted. "I thought I'd never fall in love again." In interviews, he didn't shy away from his pain. "People think fame protects you," he said. "But fame doesn't stop heartbreak, it just puts it on display." That vulnerability, that willingness to admit pain, became one of his most endearing qualities. Fans saw in him not just a superstar, but a man who could stumble and still get back up. Then came the health battles. In 2000, Stewart was diagnosed with thyroid cancer, a terrifying revelation for any person, but especially for a singer whose entire identity was tied to his voice. The surgery to remove the tumor was successful, but it damaged his vocal cords, leaving him unable to sing for months. The silence that followed was haunting. "It was like losing a part of myself," he said. "I didn't know if I'd ever sing again." During his recovery, Stewart faced depression and fear. For the first time, the unstoppable showman was forced to sit still, to confront his mortality. Yet, it was in that silence that he found something unexpected: gratitude. He realized how deeply he loved his craft, his family, and even his fans. When you come that close to losing everything, he reflected, you start to see what really matters. After months of rehabilitation, he slowly regained his voice. When he finally returned to the studio, it wasn't the same voice, it was richer, deeper, more soulful. That rasp, now carrying a hint of fragility, became a symbol of survival. His comeback album, It Had to Be You, The Great American Songbook, 2002, was a stunning success. It introduced him to a new generation and marked a transformation, from rock rebel to elder statesman of classic pop. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man once known for wild antics was now crooning timeless love songs in tuxedos. Yet, beneath the polished image, the same restless heartbeat. He had learned that survival in the music world wasn't about clinging to the past, it was about finding new ways to tell your story. Still, the scars of fame ran deep. Rod had outlived trends, scandals, and rivals, but he couldn't escape the ache of aging. The stage, once his playground, was now a battlefield. Every tour demanded more energy than his body could give. Every performance became a test of will. Yet, every night, as the crowd sang along to Sailing or Have I Told You Lately, he found strength again. The 2000s brought both peace and perspective. His marriage to Penny Lancaster in 2007 marked a turning point. Unlike his earlier relationships, this one was built on understanding and patience. Penny, a photographer and TV personality, helped Rod embrace the calmer rhythms of family life. Together, they had 2 sons, and for the first time, Stewart allowed himself to slow down, just a little. But tragedy was never far away. In 2023, Rod revealed that both his brothers, Don and Bob, had passed away within months of each other. Their deaths shook him profoundly. "Losing them felt like losing pieces of my childhood," he said softly. It reminded him, once again, that even legends are not immune to loss. And yet, in interviews around his 80th birthday, Stewart's tone was one of grace rather than regret. "I've had a good run," he smiled. "I've made mistakes, loved deeply, sung my heart out, and I'm still standing." But standing came at a price. The surgeries, the exhaustion, and the emotional toll of outliving so many friends and loved ones weighed heavily. At 80, he often spoke about mortality with an honesty that made fans ache. "You can't fight time," he said. "You just make peace with it." Rod Stewart had fought through heartbreak, illness, and the ruthless churn of fame, and somehow he was still here. But as the world celebrated his longevity, he quietly wrestled with a question that haunted every artist who had lived too long in the spotlight. What happens when the spotlight fades? The answer, as it turned out, would define the rest of his life. By the time Rod Stewart turned 80, the roar of the crowd still stirred his heart, but it no longer masked the pain. Decades of performing, traveling, and living under the spotlight had taken their toll. His voice, once a symbol of vitality and freedom, had become fragile. The legs that once danced effortlessly across stages now carried the weight of age and memory. And the man who once lived as though time would never touch him now faced its slow, unrelenting truth. In interviews, Stewart spoke openly about his health battles, refusing to hide behind bravado. In 2000, he survived thyroid cancer, and in 2019, he quietly revealed that he had also battled prostate cancer for 2 years, a fight he endured privately until remission. "You've got to keep smiling," he said. "That's what gets you through it." His optimism had always been his armor, but behind those words was the quiet fear that every singer knows, the fear of silence. For someone whose life had always been measured in songs, the threat of losing his voice felt like a kind of death. "It's my life," he once said. "Take away my voice, and I'm not me anymore." Doctors had warned him to rest, to preserve what remained of his legendary tone, but Rod wasn't built for stillness. Even in his late 70s, he continued to tour, record, and perform, determined to keep his promise to the fans who had grown up with him. But the stage had changed. The spotlights, once a symbol of triumph, now carried a bittersweet glow. The cheers still came, but he could feel the years in his bones. Sometimes, during long sets, he would take short pauses, catching his breath between verses. Fans noticed, but they didn't mind. They sang louder, filling in for him, a gesture of love and gratitude that brought tears to his eyes. In quiet moments backstage, Rod often reflected on how far he had come. From busking on the streets of London to knighthood, from heartbreak to fatherhood, from rock and roll excess to survival, his journey had been nothing short of extraordinary. Yet, in the stillness after the shows, he sometimes sat alone, staring at the dressing room mirror, feeling the shadow of time creeping closer. He began to talk about retirement more often. "There's a time when you've got to hang up the mic," he said in one interview. "But every time I think about it, I can't do it. Singing is who I am." It was a painful paradox. His love for performing was the very thing that kept him alive, yet it was also the thing that exhausted him the most. Health complications forced him to slow down, even when his spirit refused. He suffered from knee pain, back problems, and lingering fatigue from years on the road. In 2024, he was forced to cancel several tour dates due to health concerns, a decision that broke his heart. "I hate letting fans down," he said quietly, "but I've got to look after myself now." For the first time, Rod began to truly face the idea of an ending. Not just of his career, but of his era. So many of his peers were gone: David Bowie, George Michael, Tina Turner. "It's strange," he mused, "watching your generation disappear. You start to feel like the last man standing." That sense of loneliness haunted him. The camaraderie of the old days, the laughter, the chaos, the friendships, had given way to reflection, to silence, to ghosts. Yet, there was still light in his life. His wife Penny and their 2 sons became his anchor. Penny, more than anyone, understood the private version of Rod, the gentle, self-deprecating man who loved family dinners, who cherished time at home more than the glamour of fame. "She saved me," he said simply. "She gave me peace." In recent years, Stewart had also grown closer to his older children, finding reconciliation and understanding that had once seemed impossible. He had made amends for absences and mistakes, reaching out with humility and love. "I wasn't always the best dad," he admitted, "but I've tried to make it right." Family, that's the real success story. Away from the stage, he found solace in his old passions: model railways, football, and painting. These quiet hobbies, once mere pastimes, became therapy. In his home studio, he would spend hours crafting intricate model cities, building tiny worlds where time didn't move so cruelly. It was a kind of escape, a way to control what life could not. But even as he found peace, the emotional toll of aging lingered. In one of his last major interviews, he spoke with rare vulnerability. "The tragedy of growing old is not just losing your strength, it's watching the world move on without you. But I'm proud of the life I've lived. I've loved deeply, I've sung my truth, and I've made people happy. What more could a man ask for?" That question hung in the air, full of both pride and resignation. By 2025, the rumors of his retirement had become louder. Friends said he was considering one final tour, not for money, not for fame, but for closure. He wanted to say goodbye properly, to stand before his audience one last time and thank them for giving his life meaning. That tour, simply titled Forever Young, the last song, became a love letter to his fans. Each performance felt like a farewell, filled with laughter, nostalgia, and tears. The set lists were chosen carefully, the songs that had defined his life: Maggie May, You're in My Heart, Sailing, Forever Young. Each note carried decades of memory, each lyric a piece of his soul. At the final concert held in London, the city where it all began, the crowd sang the final chorus of Sailing long after Rod's voice faded. He stood silently, tears streaming down his face, his hand over his heart. It was not a goodbye to music, it was a goodbye to the man he had been. As the lights dimmed that night, Rod whispered something to Penny, who stood side stage, watching him with quiet pride. "That's it, love," he said softly. "I'm finally home." There is a kind of silence that only comes after a lifetime of noise. The silence that follows the applause, the tours, the chaos, and the fame. For Rod Stewart, that silence arrived not as an end, but as a deep exhale. After decades of chasing the next song, the next show, the next thrill, he finally allowed himself to stop and listen, to the quiet rhythm of his own heart, to the voices of his children, to the peace that comes with knowing you've lived your life fully. When he stepped off the stage after his Forever Young, the last song tour, the moment was almost sacred. For the first time in 60 years, there were no set lists waiting, no rehearsals, no flashing lights. Just him and Penny, hand in hand, walking away from the stage lights into something softer, something real. It was, in every sense, a homecoming. Retirement for Rod Stewart wasn't a retreat, it was a revelation. He had been Rod the rock star for so long that even he had forgotten what it felt like to simply be Rod the man. In the quiet of his countryside home, away from the noise of the industry, he rediscovered the simple joys that fame had once stolen. Waking up without an alarm, cooking breakfast for his family, listening to the birds outside his window instead of the roar of an audience. But he could never completely walk away from music.
"It's in me," he once said.
"It's like blood, it keeps me alive." Even in retirement, he would hum melodies while tending to his model trains or scribble down lines of lyrics in the middle of the night. Friends who visited said his house always had music playing, from old Motown records to the new artists he admired. Music had raised him, saved him, and carried him through heartbreak and illness. It was his oldest and most loyal friend. Rod's love for family deepened in those final years. Penny became his partner not only in life but in peace. Their sons, Alistair and Aidan, were growing into young men, and Rod poured himself into fatherhood with a tenderness that his younger self never had time for. He spoke often of his older children, 8 in all, with pride and humility. "I've learned more from being a dad than from anything else," he admitted. "It's my greatest role." He would host family dinners, gather everyone around a long wooden table, and tell stories from his wild years. Tales of endless nights in LA, recording sessions gone wrong, the wild parties, the heartbreaks, the laughs. His children would laugh, sometimes shake their heads, but always listen. In those moments, the rock star disappeared, and only the father remained. Yet, for all the light in his later years, there was also a quiet sadness that lingered. The body that had once seemed indestructible now reminded him daily of its limits. The voice, though still recognizable, had grown raspier, a whisper of what it once was. The man who once filled stadiums now found joy in singing lullabies to his grandchildren. Friends noticed the change in him, a gentler, more reflective Rod. He spoke less about fame and more about faith, not necessarily in religion, but in the simple act of gratitude. He would say things like, "Every morning's a gift now. I wake up, and I thank the good Lord that I can still see the sky." He knew time was catching up. "I've cheated death a few times," he said with a smile. "But you can't outrun it forever." Still, he refused to dwell on fear. Instead, he embraced the inevitable with grace. "When it's my time," he once said softly, "I'll go knowing I've done it all, I've sung my song." In 2025, Rod Stewart began to retreat further from the public eye. Fans noticed fewer appearances, fewer interviews. When asked, Penny simply said, "He's taking time for himself now." Behind that statement was a truth that only family knew: Rod's health was declining. The years of touring, the surgeries, the stress had worn him down. But he remained upbeat, never allowing despair to show. "He doesn't want anyone to feel sorry for him," said one close friend. He says, "I've had more luck than I ever deserved." And so, he faced the twilight of his life the same way he faced every challenge, with humor, courage, and love. His days were filled with small joys: tea on the patio with Penny, watching football matches, tinkering with his train set, phone calls from his children scattered around the world. Every now and then, he'd pick up a guitar and play softly. Sometimes, if the mood was right, he'd sing. Not for an audience, not for applause, just for himself. Penny would often find him that way, eyes closed, lost in the melody, as if revisiting every memory that had ever shaped him. If Rod Stewart's incredible journey touched your heart, his courage, his music, his laughter, and his fight through life's toughest storms, then don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss the next story that moves the world.